Hi everyone, I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader, and it has been a rough couple of weeks, hasn't it? The American elections happened, and the result was very depressing and upsetting. I voted since I live in London. I sent my absentee ballot in very dutifully, and yeah, it's been it's really devastating and scary, and I feel really angry and upset. And so I found it quite difficult to do much of anything during this time, but I've still continued reading. And something that I've found comforting is I read the beginning section of this book called The Faith of the Writer by Joyce Carol Oates. It's a book of essays. And the very first essay in it I'm going to read because I think it's something that's important to remember during times like this. She writes, "My faith as a writer. I believe that art is the highest expression of the human spirit. I believe that we yearn to transcend the merely finite and ephemeral, to participate in something mysterious and communal called culture, and that this yearning is as strong in our species as the yearning to reproduce the species. Through the local or regional, through our individual voices, we work to create art that will speak to others who know nothing of us. In our very obliqueness to one another, an unexpected intimacy is born. The individual voice is the communal voice. The regional voice is the universal voice." And I think that speaks really powerfully about how the connections we make to one another through literature, even though this is a very private act. So I'm going to delve in and talk about the books that I've been reading recently for the first half of November. And I did read 4 books over this time, starting with Fiona Melrose's novel Midwinter. This is her debut novel with the beautiful cover of the lovely little fox on the front. And it turns out that the fox is a fairly major character in this book, although in a very sort of slight sort of background way, because the main story is about a father and son. At the beginning of the novel, the son has a very severe accident with his friend, and his friend winds up in hospital severely injured, and it makes this sort of crisis point where the son and his father try to connect in ways that they haven't connected emotionally in a long time. And it's very powerful and moving. This father and son who live working as farmers in rural Suffolk, and the mother of the family, she died some time ago in a very traumatic way, and the father and son have to sort of confront this as they try to struggle to deal with the friend's injuries. And over the course of that time, the father keeps seeing in the distance of the farm this female fox, and her struggles to survive, and he connects with that struggle, and he develops a compassion for her, and it becomes this great metaphor of the people close to us in our lives who we may not physically connect with or speak to, or but they're a presence there in our lives, and we have a connection with them, and it's really movingly done. It sort of moves between scenes in the present of the farm, and then scenes in Africa when they had moved there to try to make a living, and the different struggles that they encounter in each place. And I really admire how Fiona Melrose writes about the really hard economic struggles that families face and the strain it puts families under. I don't think that's written about very much, about the economic realities, how much they impact upon people's personal lives and can tear families apart and create all sorts of painful challenges. So this is a really lovely, very moving novel. Some really powerful writing about the hard, gritty reality of farm life, but also very like poetic language used, and really movingly describes the emotions of men. Fiona Melrose is a female writer, but but she writes mostly all about men in this novel, except for the mother, who is mostly an absent presence. So I think it's really admirable, and yeah, it bears repeating once again. It has a really lovely, beautiful cover. The next book I read is called Cove by Siren Jones. This was published by Granta Books, and it has a really lovely cover too. I've never read Siren Jones before. It's a very short, compact novel, and the prose are very like compact, very like distilled. The story is a narrative. It is fiction, but it reads in some ways like poetry because there's so much packed into each sentence that I had to go back and read some sections multiple times. Not particularly because the content of them is so complex or obscure that I had to unpack it, but to get the full like resonant meaning of it, I felt like I had to read it multiple times. And it's basically about a man who goes out on a boat on a kayak to fish, and a storm suddenly comes upon him, and he gets hit by lightning, and he's injured, and it suddenly jolts him out of his present everyday reality. And I think it's really powerful how he describes how there are these moments in life, you know, when you're sort of ripped out of the normal course of what's happening in your daily existence. You just sort of go about your day, and we don't often think about the scale of our lives. But there are certain moments when something traumatic happens, and it's just like you're sort of taken out of time almost. It's like time doesn't really exist in the way that it normally does, and you're suddenly aware of your mortality, and your identity gets stripped down to sort of nothing, so that you're wondering who you are, what you're doing. And this is what happens to the man in the novel, and he's suddenly questioning what everything is around him, not in a ponderously philosophical way, but in a real practical way of like, what am I doing here? But he's driven by this instinct for survival, and he's trying to get back to the shore, which is proving very difficult because he's injured. And also these memories are flooding back to him, both of his family back home and his grandfather, and thoughts about the war that happened around him. And there's some almost spooky passages where he's describing his father's ashes and the spreading of his ashes, and so you get this strong sense of the passing of generations, and how like wars were fought in this bay, and people who have come before, and how he connects to those people. And this is described all amidst the minute reality of his existence in the moment as he's struggling to get back to shore. And so even though this is a very short novel, I think it's an incredibly powerful one, and one that should be read slowly and carefully. The next book I was reading was Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, and this was published by Fleet in the UK. And I was halfway through reading this novel when the elections happened, and suddenly this novel started to take on a whole other resonance for me, because it's about the early 1800s, and a woman named Cora who lives on a plantation as a slave, and her experiences as a fellow slave. He invites her to run away with him on the Underground Railroad, and Colson Whitehead really ingeniously in this makes the Underground Railroad a physical reality as an actual railroad that ran underground in the States, transporting slaves from the south to the north. And this obviously never really existed. The Underground Railroad historically was just a chain network of people who helped slaves to get to the north by staying in different safe points. But here he uses it in a whole other way, so that she travels on the Underground Railroad and she arrives in different states. And not only does she arrive in different physical states, but in different potential realities for America. In each community she visits, she finds a different way that that community is dealing with the issue of race, because America has this big blight on it of the history of slavery, and this has created an inheritance of division and racism. And in each of these communities, they deal with it in a different way. When the first place she arrives in is South Carolina, and seems like this sort of idyllic place where she's allowed to be free out in the open, be her own person, to earn money, to just walk down the streets looking in department stores and have total freedom of self. But as time goes on, she learns that there are hidden levels of division in this community. There's a nefarious process taking place where medical doctors are suggesting to black women that they become sterilized to stop them procreating. And so, on top of very overt racism in the novel and really overt violence, there are different layers of racism going on, and I think it's really ingenious how Colson Whitehead does this to make us think in a more complex way about our communities, about the different ways that racism exists. But apart from these very like high concepts, it's also just a gripping, really well written story about Cora's journey. Cora, when she at first on the plantation, when she's about 10 years old, her mother leaves her and runs away, and she becomes the only slave on the plantation to have successfully run away and stayed away. But it's created this increasing burning resentment in Cora for the mother who left her behind. I mean, there's been a lot of stories about people who have been abandoned, children who have been abandoned and become adopted, and having to deal with those feelings and of abandonment. And but this seems like a whole other level. I mean, if you can imagine, your parent has not only left you, but they've left you in a situation where you're in bondage, where you're a slave, where you're likely to be beaten and raped, as Cora is, and knowing that her mother has left her to that and not understanding why. So that creates this tension throughout the entire novel, which is very powerful. But yeah, also in terms of the reality of what was happening in life, with the America's next president's very overt racism, and it seems like a very potent and relevant book for now. So I was very glad to be reading this at the time, but at the same time, it was really devastating, because it just brings home how all these issues are still present and real in America, and it's really upsetting and scary. So yeah, sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional thinking about it. So I think more than any other book I've read recently, if you want to read something that's really relevant for now, I would definitely recommend this book. And finally, I finished reading this anthology of short stories by different writers called The Glass Shore, edited by Sinead Gleeson, and this is published by New Island Books. And it is short stories by women writers from the north of Ireland. And this is sort of a sequel anthology to one which was published last year called The Long Gaze Back. And this is an anthology of Irish women writers from Ireland and Northern Ireland. And this was one of my favorite books last year. I've discovered so many great writers through this book. And the same, I think, is true in The Glass Shore. It's full of wonderful, really engaging and fun and moving and powerful short stories across from 2 centuries. How the stories are sort of laid out is in kind of chronological order of when they were written. It starts sort of in the 1800s with a short story by a woman named Rosa Mulholland, who writes a short story called The Mystery of Aura, which is a really bizarre, almost kind of like fable-like short story about a woman who lives trapped in this tower with a creepy man, and what's really happening there. A sort of traveler comes along and intervenes, and it ends in present time with a short story called "The Seventh Man" by Royce O'Donnell, who writes this wonderful story about a mythical woman who survives over centuries by sort of draining the energy of men, and it's about a seventh husband that she takes, and the men that she's encountered over the centuries, which is a very fitting ending to this anthology, which spans over 2 centuries of writing and thoughts. Each individual story is really interesting and exciting in itself. Over the course of reading the anthology, you get this growing sense of just the varying perspectives of women from the north of Ireland over time, and it creates this powerful sort of overarching meaning to the whole book. But there's some absolutely wonderful standout stories in between. There's this great, really moving story called "The Village Without Men" by Margaret Barrington, where these women, it starts with these women desperately trying to retrieve their men from the sea who have gone fishing and who have all died in a shipwreck, and this village is just left mostly without men, and it's how they survive and get on and continue without them. There's also a great, really, in some ways, comic and in a lot of ways tragic story called Taft's Wife by Caroline Blackwood, about a man who's trying to reunite this orphan boy who was given up by his mother with this society woman who gave him up at a certain point in her life, and she takes him to this fancy restaurant, and she outrageously starts flirting with this man, and sort of ignoring the son who she's just been reunited with. It's really heartbreaking, the shallowness of this woman, but also really touching and moving, because you know that she's avoiding all these complex feelings and trying to block them out and deny them, and also the tragedy of this poor boy sitting there wanting to reconnect with his mother, who completely ignores him. And there's a short story called "The Negotiator" by Anne-Marie Neary. Not all of the stories are set in Northern Ireland. This actually takes place in Algiers, and a woman who goes there during a time of conflict to try to negotiate a drilling license and take financial advantage of the country, and she finds herself swept up in this conflict which she doesn't really fully understand, and it makes a really powerful statement. And Anne-Marie Neary also published this novel this year called Siren, which I haven't read yet, but I've really wanted to get to. A lot of these writers, the more recent ones, are just publishing a lot of fiction now. So these stories make a wonderful jumping off point to discover a lot of other great writers. Like in the long gaze back, I first read Lisa McNerney, who wrote this wonderful novel called The Glorious Heresies, which has won multiple awards this year. So I really look forward to discovering a lot of these other writers' work, both current and in the past, of writers who I've never heard of, like the one I mentioned, Caroline Blackwood, who wrote a number of novels that I now want to read. Also this fantastic story called The Devil's Gift by Frances Malloy, about a young woman who comes from a large family, who enters a nunnery, and the horrible things which happen to her in this nunnery, and she's sort of pressured out of the faith. And these stories, in all their different permutations, really explore a lot of different ideas and different dilemmas that women face in Northern Ireland. A lot of the older stories show how, through sort of craft and ingenuity, women can break out of the confines of the very provincial settings within which they're born. And as the times of conflict in Northern Ireland occur, there's a lot more stronger sense in some of the stories about this dilemma between Catholics and Protestants, and nationalists and unionists ideas about whether, well, are we Irish, are we British, and the conflict that makes. And then there are other stories which are very domestic and which don't have anything to do with that, and some which are from men's points of view, and so it shows a real diversity of voice, diversity of opinion. And one of the most recent short stories, the second to last story, is called Mayday by Lucy Caldwell. And Lucy Caldwell wrote a book of short stories which was published earlier this year called Multitudes, which is absolutely beautiful. And this story, Mayday, is about a girl who has gone to university and has become pregnant, and she takes rather dangerous measures to try to get rid of that pregnancy. And this is a very topical issue for Ireland right now about the issue of abortion. And I think sadly it's going to become a very topical issue again in America with recent election. And it shows how this is an ongoing conversation amongst particular people in particular places. But overall, these stories are just really engaging and enjoyable, and I loved reading the diversity of them, all the exciting new voices I found, and writers that I really want to explore their work a lot more. So I hope to read a lot of their other books in the coming year. But I'd really recommend this book. I think it's a great thing for winter too, to get a book of short stories just to read now and then in the morning if you wake up early in the morning like I do. I think it's a great way to start the day by reading a short story. So highly recommend this. But I'd like to hear from you about what you've been reading. Have you read any of these books, and what do you think of them? And how have you been coping with everything that's been going on? So leave your comments below and we can keep the discussion going there, because please, let's keep reading and discussing and trying to have a conversation during these very difficult and scary times. So thank you for watching, and if you want to see more of my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks very much. See you later, guys, and happy reading.